So welcome to everybody. Last year we had a season of seminars from Women Weaving Future, which we will continue this year, and we will start with Nilüfer Koç. We invited. Nilüfer Koç is a member of the Executive Council and spokesperson for the Commission on Foreign Relations for the Kurdistan National Congress. And today we will talk about the socialist practice and the perspectives from the Workers' Party Kurdistan, the PKK, also known as PKK, because we always know the PKK in the Kurdish question and the Kurdish liberation struggle. But beyond that, the PKK had a lot of experience, practice experience with socialism, so we call it socialist practice. Therefore, we invited Nilüfer Koç so that she can talk and explain a little bit more about this experience and what does it mean, for example, more than the Middle East. Nilüfer?
So I could not hear you, sorry.
Couldn't, oh.
Can I start now? Shall I start
Yeah,
now?
yeah, you can start.
Okay. Thank you, Berfin, and thank you, the organizers of Women Waving Future, for this, for having me this evening to speak at a very important topic, the topic of the specific character or understanding of the PKK of socialism. It is a very complicated issue to talk about a movement which is centralized, which is acting in Middle East, in the world's most dangerous and war zone and global war zone in the Middle East. The PKK, since its foundation until today, is acting in three dimensions parallelly. The national one means in Kurdistan, Middle East, and global. I will try to make it simple that the characteristic of understanding of PKK could be understood by the audience. So for that purpose, I prepared PowerPoint presentations so that particularly the question why the PKK is seen as a threat by the global players, why it become listed on in many countries on the list of terrorist organizations, and why the NATO is backing Turkey to defeat the PKK in the last 40 years. So, the name PKK means PKK and Kurdistan. Translated to English, it means the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Officially, the PKK was founded on 27th November 1978. The reason why Abdullah Öcalan and his friends, the first group, which was formed in Ankara, at the university in Ankara in Turkey, decided to found the PKK was right at the beginning, when the group was in formation. One of their members, namely Haki Karer, was murdered on the 18th May 1977. Haki Karer was one of the key figures in the founding process of the PKK from 70s until 77. He was killed in the city of Antep by an organization called the Red Star, which was later found out that they are acting as a element of the counter-guerrilla operation of the NATO, which was called Gladio. After the murder of Haki Karer, he was by origin Turkish. Abdullah Öcalan said, our political platform and the name of our organization, the PKK, was set up and decided to open as an immediate consequences of Haki Karer's murderer. We all regard it as his legacy. So the response to the killing of Haki Karer was the foundation of the PKK in a year later. Back to the history of the PKK. Understanding today's PKK's socialism, it is important to understand the work during the foundation in the 70s. As I said, PKK was founded in 1978. At that time, the world was divided in bipolar politics between the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Always clashes, conflicts were happening between the real socialism and capitalism. And we heard a lot about the Cold War. The 70s are also known for the era of national liberation movements in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. One of the influences of the 70s were this 68 student movement, and also the 70s were known by the anti-Vietnam and anti-Vietnam War and anti-apartheid movements. In the 70s, also in Turkey, the revolutionary socialist movements were very powerful, and also moves of anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist parties were increasing. The 70s are also important for us as women, as it is the era of the feminist movements. In Turkey, the University of Ankara was a center for revolutionary student movements. At this university, Abdullah Öcalan and later on a member of the founding member of the PKK were studying in Ankara. Kurdistan in the 70s was described by Öcalan as a regional and global colony of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Definition of Kurdistan as an international colony is because Turkey became right after the Second World War in 1952 member of the NATO. Whenever Turkey acts against the Kurds or other revolutionary elements in Turkey, it's backed by the NATO. That's why the Kurdish problem in Turkey has also international character. Being built in the 70s, under these circumstances I described, PKK decided for the solution of the Kurdish problem to choose the ideology of socialism. At that time, it was decided to run a party according to Leninist party model. In this, PKK was anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonialist. Right at the beginning until today, the PKK is known for its character of internationalism because in the foundation, together with Öcalan, two key figures, Turkish origin, Haki Kare and Kemal Pir, were participating and leading the PKK. In the 80s, PKK was in very deep solidarity with the Palestinian people. And since the beginning until today, the PKK insists to cooperate with several revolutionary movements in Turkey. One other important characteristic of the PKK in the 70s is that the PKK already every time was opened its doors and gates for participation of women in politics. And one other characteristic of the PKK is its grassroots orientated. So the formation from 1970 until 1999, it can be said that first from 1970, when Öcalan starts to study university political science at the university in Ankara, he was involved to understand the revolutionary Turkish movements. Up to until 1978, one can say the PKK was morally busy with finding its ideological identity. We call it the movement of ideological affirmation. Before that, the movement was called the Apoist movement, the short name of Abdullah Öcalan. So the group was called those around Abdullah Öcalan, or shortly Apoists. From 1970 to 1978, there's a break. From 1970 to 1976, the PKK decided to go to Kurdistan and to examine the situation of the Kurds, and also to look for ground of the decolonization process and struggle for Kurdistan. After gaining enough experiences in different parts of Bakur Kurdistan, the northern part, the Turkish occupied part, then it was decided to found the PKK, particularly after the killing of Haki Kare in 1977. Very early, the PKK understand that it is not possible to act politically, means awakening the Kurdish people from colonialism. There's a need of defense. Since Kurdistan was occupied by a Turkish state, the northern part of Kurdistan, and Turkey, a state found on the blood of Armenians, found on a genocide against several ethnic groups in Turkey. It is a state which denied the existence of others than Turks. A Turkish nation state with its character was brutal to all those ethnic groups like the Armenians, the Arabs, the Alawites, the Yazidis, the Kurds. And therefore, PKK have seen there's need of defending the structures which were built in all cities and villages in Kurdistan. Therefore, on the 15th of August, 1984, the PKK was founding its army, the first army, the People's Liberation Army of Kurdistan. With the army and the political party, the PKK, all around Kurdistan, mass movements were starting. It called in the 90s the Sahel dance. Interestingly, in this time, in this period, when in Kurdistan the Sahel dance starts, the uprisings and mass movements in Kurdistan starts, it was already the end of the era of other people's revolutions. It was the era of the collapse of real socialism. Contrary to the collapse of real socialism, the PKK was forced to change its trend because of the participation of thousands of women with the Sahel dance. The participation of women in the PKK made another characteristic differences of the PKK comparing with other revolutionary movements in Middle East. I will explain this later on. From 1999 to 99, PKK already were organizing the Kurds, not just in Turkey, also in Syria, in Rojava, in Iranian part of Kurdistan called Rojava Kurdistan, and in South Kurdistan, northern Iraq. So it became a serious political actor in Middle East. For that reason, the US, together with Israel and other European states, forced Öcalan to leave the Middle East. From 97 until 98, Öcalan was based in Syria and Damascus, but also were teaching people, Kurdish society in Rojava for 20 years. On 9th October 98, he was forced to leave Syria after 20 years work in Syria. And he came to Europe and seek for asylum. He came to Europe to find a political solution to the Kurdish cause. But unfortunately, he was then abducted on the 15th February 99. The abduction of Öcalan is a turning point in the history of PKK from 1970 to 1999. As I said before, when real socialism was collapsed, Öcalan was already since 86 busy with understanding the backgrounds and reason of the collapse, and have seen that there's need of a new alternative system, and there's a new continuation and finding out the mistakes of real socialism. He said after his abduction, he was forced to go deeper to the reason why real socialism collapsed. And he was forced to see the truth of capitalist, the brutality of the truth of capitalist system, because he became a victim of capitalist system when he was abducted by the capitalist states. And that's why he said, I understood myself as a continuation of the struggles of people for socialism, for democracy. And I was forced to understand capitalism better than anyone, since I experienced the brutal form of my abduction by capitalist system. In his prison cell on prison island of Imralı, where he's being held since 1999, he wrote for the first time in 2001, his first defense writing, the book called Capitalism, the Age of Unmasked Gods and Naked Kings. a manifesto for democratic civilization. In this first book, he describes the history of capitalist modernity, its different evolutions, and also parallelly the history of the democratic modernity, which means nations without states. Afterwards, from 2001 until 2013, Öcalan has published 5 more extensive books about capitalist modernity and democratic modernity. All of the contents of the books were taken as a content of the new PKK, because all the suggestions made by Öcalan were accepted in the congresses of the PKK as the official party line. So that's why we can say today the PKK is it's an ideological movement and responsible for the implementation of Öcalan's paradigm. After the prison writings of Öcalan came out in 2000 and were then published in 2001, also the PKK started parallelly for a new transformation. Until 2000, the PKK was morally influenced, took over the tradition of the Marxist-Leninist party model from the 70s, which was morally seeking the party in the center of the society, and which was seeking for the solution of the Kurdish problem, a Kurdish nation state. After Öcalan's criticism of nation state as a pillar of capitalism, as a strong institution of capitalism, he was calling the PKK for decentralizing of its structures. For that, the PKK's transformation was based on politics beyond the state, political organization beyond the party, political subjectivity beyond class. So the year 2000 is important as a transformation of the PKK from national liberation movement to radical democratic movement. As I told, the abduction of Öcalan was a radical challenge for him and also for the Kurdish revolution. This is the beginning of the radical ideological break with the capitalist modernity. It's the beginning radical revolution of thought and mindset. It's also radical critical ideological examination and confrontation of the influence of the capitalist modernity on real socialism. After all these, the PKK decided to be more clear and rejecting asking the solution to the Kurdish cause and Kurdish state, and particularly founding of a Kurdish nation state. Öcalan called himself after 99, this is my third birth, which means that he was able to describe and define his model, his alternative capitalist democratic, the democratic modernity. He said, I achieved this result because I was able to liberate my thoughts and my mindset from capitalist modernity. Öcalan's and PKK's analysis of the crisis of the capitalist modernity right in the beginning after 1999 was right, because today we see that in the 21st century, and particularly after the collapse of real socialism, when the capitalist system declared its victory, we have seen that the victory could not continue until today. Instead, the capitalist system has today a very deep systemic crisis. And this systemic crisis is now spreading all over the world, but centered in the Middle East. When the first Gulf War starts, the PKK and Öcalan is calling the first Gulf War also the beginning of the Third World War. The specific identity of this Third World War is that it's not bipolar, it's multipolar political power sharing. The aim of this multipolar political power sharing is to design the region of Middle Eastern from new. The war is a kind of the war which the capitalist system is now attempting in Middle East and other parts in the world has the aim to rescue itself from the crisis which is experiencing now very deeply. Currently, particularly the focus of this war is the Middle East, and the global players as leading powers of capitalist modernity are trying to build new nation states in the region. And for that, and reforming some older nation states which were built after the First World War, like Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, Libya, Yemen. Because all these states, which were founded after the First World War, were nation states based on one nation, one language, one identity. All these states are because of the uprisings of the diverse ethnic groups and religion groups in these different countries. They are uprising, and this is why most of the states are now in a crisis and a very deep chaos. We're talking about the societal and political crisis and chaos in Middle East. And that means that those who implemented the idea of nation states can't rule the societies through these nation states, because these nation states were now oppressive organs against diverse societies in the region. Therefore, we have a picture of increasing of wars and conflicts in the region, increase of women's problems. We are speaking about feminicide, and we have extension of environmental destruction, not just in Middle East, but in the whole world, like the problem of climate, the burning of forests, the cutting of forests in Amazons, in Brazil. We have a problem of water. We have a problem of pandemic. Through the unemployed, through the robotization and digitalization, we have a problem of unemployment all around the world. So that's why the thesis and the analysis of Öcalan in his books from 2000 are right when he speaks about the systemic crisis of capitalist modernity, which we feel today in the problem of climate and pandemic. To create the alternative against capitalist modernity, it was necessary to understand the deeply reasons of collapse of real socialism. In these, Öcalan came to the conclusion that real socialism was anti-capitalist, but not anti-capitalist modernity. So it means it was taking the instruments which were offered by the capitalist modernity, like the turning of socialism to to be organized in nation state. Real socialism, in the end, was opposing capitalism, the productive system of capitalism, but was not able to become ideological alternative to the capitalist modernity. Because in most of the countries with the system of real socialism, industrialism was praised highly. Technology, science of technology became a center of new religion for many of the former Soviet Union republics. In this regard, the real socialist countries, because of their focus on industrialism, haven't taken care for defending the nature. Instead, the way of the way of industrialist expansion led to destruction of nature. Also, the science of positivism was one of the main reasons why real socialism could not survive ideologically, because positivism as a science became a main measure of communist methodology in the communist parties, in which the societies were subjected as objects, and the Communist Party or the state were described as seen as subject. The destruction of nature also have had negatively results for the societies, and also everywhere the electrification and growing of industry achieved the level of a religious value. The nation state was praised However, the argument was the nation state, a strong, powerful nation state is needed to defeat capitalism. In the end, the socialism was made to a victim of the nation state in the Soviet republics. That's why Öcalan said understanding capitalist modernity in its ideological base is important, and he described capitalist modernity as a state class-powered system of exploitation. Capitalist system itself is not just the issue of production, but ideological hegemony, patriarchy, mainstream civilization, which commenced with the enslavement of women in the history. For spreading and ruling of the capitalist system, the nation state became vital because of the centralization of administrative structures. The societies could be controlled better. One other threat of the nation state to the diverse societies is the homogenization of societies, which led then to conflicts, wars, human rights violations, which we have today. Through bureaucracy, the nation states were able to control the whole society. Instruments and mechanisms of threat like police, armies, courts, and the legal system were expanding. Industrialism became an instrument of dividing of the society in classes and the sources of exploitation, and also the sources of destruction of environment, and also a reason of the huge unemployment of today through digitalization and robotization. So these are the deeply critical points of Abdullah Öcalan and also by the PKK. And by saying there is no need for the societies to be ruled by a state or by centralized structures, instead of this, that the societies has more experiences in the history than the state. So he said the society don't need a state because the societies existed before the states. The states need the society for the exploitation and for ruling its hegemony. So he clearly says a liberation of the societies means the very clear line between nation and state. So the democratic socialism, democratic modernity of Abdullah Öcalan is focused on the societies, not on state building. And his efforts in the last 20 years through the PKK was to implement grassroots democracy and finding the instrument in which the grassroots democracy can be founded. In opposition to the capitalist modernity, the democratic modernity is based on 3 pillars. It means first, a democracy, which means societies don't need a state, since the societies existed before the state. Democracy means unity of diversity, because none of the societies in none of the countries in the world are homogeneous, whether there are diversity in religious faith, in groups of faiths, or ethnically, or language, or culturally. All these diverse communities, societies learned in the history before capitalist modernity to exist together based on mutual respect. The societies naturally has the administration form which is decentralized, which we call it the communalism or the autonomous administration according to the benefits of each society. The second important pillar is the understanding of ecology, which means keeping the balance between human and nature. So ecology means that the humans shouldn't accept themselves as a ruler of the natural values, whether these are plants or animals. And the third important pillar of democratic modernity is the women liberationist society. Because in Öcalan's theory, when you compare with Marxism, here is a clear break with the Marxist historical description of the societal stages. I will show this now in one of the other graphics. So in the classic Marxist stages of history, he says the history starts with the primitive communism, which Öcalan says this is the era of Neolithic revolution and happened in the fertile Christian in Mesopotamia. Then, according to Marx, from the primitive communism, the society was transformed to slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and in the end, communism will come. So comparing Öcalan's theory with the Marxist stages of history, he says, Marx starts with describing the problems which led to slavery. He was morally seeking the circumstances of production as a ground for slavery. But Öcalan says the real problem in the 1000-year period challenges between primitive communism and slavery says the first conflict starts not with the production, but between men and women. So primitive communism, this area is very deeply described in Öcalan's books. It's a starting history of matricentric society or mother-ruled societies. Slavery is the period where patriarchy already became a dominant ruling system. And Öcalan says the first slaves were the women in history. So the conflict and the description of classes, which Marx has in his stages of history, says, Öcalan says the first classes were built up between men and women. So according to Öcalan, the bourgeoisie became the man, or the slaveholder as the man, and the slave as the women, not the opposite. And the discrimination, exploitation of women continued during all the stages of history. But Öcalan said these deterministic stages of this deterministic description of stages of history shouldn't be like this, because he said the democratic modernity, which means the history of self-ruling of any societies starts before capitalist modernity, before the class society, has enough experiences for self-ruling. It has its own dynamic. There's no need that any society should experience capitalism to come to communism or socialism. He said we have to understand history as two rivers in the last 5,000 years since the beginning of patriarchy in between primitive communism and slavery. He says there are two rivers flowing parallelly. One is the river of capitalist modernity, the other one of democratic modernity. So he is rejecting this reduction of society in this linear form, and saying there's a dynamic of the democratic modernity. So what we can do is looking in the values of each societies, the values of moral and political understanding, and encouraging the society for its own move. The role of revolutionaries should be helping the societies to understanding the other river, the capitalist modernity. In this, he describes the role of the PKK as an instrument, not as an instrument of oppression, but instrument of convincing the societies of democratic modernity not to be manipulated by the organs, institutions of capitalist modernity like the nation state. And that's why there's a main difference between the class structures of Marxism and Öcalan's understanding of socialism, which he says the first classes were division between men and women, between patriarchalism and matricentristic societies. So, and he said there's no need that any society have to experience the highest technological form of capitalism and then afterwards socialism would come. He said, no, there is no need for that. So the society shouldn't wait until the highest level, which Lenin described as the finance capitalism with the highest technology and positive science and the production through the robotized industrialism. Öcalan says in Middle East, it's easier to awakening the elements of the natural moral and political awarenesses in the societies, since the societies in Middle East are not that much affected by nation states as instrument of capitalist modernity. And the nation states were imposed on the societies in Middle East. And the other specific part of the people in Middle East, particularly the Kurds, Öcalan says, it's the truth that they experienced long time of freedom in the time of the Neolithic era, which is also described as the Fertile Crescent, which is in history books you find it as Mesopotamia. So this is the ancient region where the Kurds came from, and other groups like the Persians and the Armenians and other communities were here. And the specific point of the Neolithic revolution is important to Öcalan because he says the solution for today's problems we can see also in the time of the Neolithic revolution, the solution how to deal with economy, the solution keeping the balance between humans and the nature, the so-called environment, can be we can learn a lot from that this period of history, which is known as a very matricentristic societal culture. So what is the specific point of the Neolithic revolution according to Öcalan is that in this time, you can see in this cartoon, people were building houses or shelters, food supply was offered, the highest technology was developed in this time, people got work, there was a work conditions for different parts of the society. Trade was done between the different tribes and clans at that time, and domestication of the animals happened. So this was not the reason why the people, why the societies during the Neolithic revolution have fought. Instead, sharing of natural resources, sharing of productions, were a common understanding as a value of the societies at that time. And he says the elements, values of this time are still in the you can find still in the Kurdish society. That's why he says the Kurds are able to improve the new socialism for the 21st century, which means, first of all, because the Kurds never gained a nation state through which the capitalist system could implement its hegemony. And the Kurds has long experience with matricentristic culture. That's why the Kurdish women's movement became very powerful when Öcalan helped the women to find back their roots in the history. He is clear in the separation of concept between nation and state, and and the PKK is concentrated in a bottom-up system, which is called the grassroots democracy as a base for socialism. Women's liberation is the key, and I would say the most specific point of Öcalan. Through liberation of women, it is possible to defeat the patriarchal system, which is the ground of today's capitalism. These are the main important point of the PKK's understanding of socialism. I must add that today all these ideas are implemented in several parts of Kurdistan, Rojava, in Turkish part of Kurdistan, and also it's influencing southern part of Kurdistan, and you can find a huge sympathy for this idea of a new democratic socialism also in Iranian part of Kurdistan, Rojhelat. But since 1999, the PKK mostly use the terminology of democracy than socialism, not because after the collapse of socialism, real socialism, the definition of socialism was criminalized. No, because the understanding is unless you have a wider, deepened democratic structures in the society, you can't speak about socialism. So there wouldn't be any successful experiences of socialism without democracy. That's why the main focus now in the last 20 years is to help the societies to find their own, to implement their own values of political organizations, of culture, of economy, of ecology. So the understanding of socialism for the PKK needs spreading democracy all around Kurdistan and in Middle East. This is from my part, Berfin. I think this is enough for the first part. So if there are questions, I would then try to answer them.
Thank you very, very much, Nilüfer. I hope you can hear me, because you said before that you can't hear my voice. Do you hear me right now? Okay. So we have some questions. First of all, for example, to what extent are patriarchy and Eurocentrism an obstacle to understand Abdullah Öcalan? Would you like to hear all of the questions or just part?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Okay, I can repeat the question again. So you talked about the idea of Abdullah Öcalan, and now it is interesting to have the bridge to here too, from the Middle East to Europe. And so we had the question like, to what extent are patriarchy and Eurocentrism an obstacle to understand Abdullah Öcalan?
Well, I think Eurocentrism is an obstacle to understand the world, not just Kurdistan or the PKK or Öcalan. Every new modernity, particularly the capitalist modernity, which has made huge experience in the last 500 years in Europe, were claiming that Europe is the place where civilization was created and that Europe is the center of the world. So there's a kind of arrogancy in politics. You see this saying, well, whatever capitalism or socialism, every progressive ideas came up from Europe. So the same was said by the other empires when they were becoming hegemonial powers, like the Ottoman Empire or the other empires, or the Chinese Empire. Whoever became an empire, they said they started the civilization as a legitimation of their ideological dominancy. In this regard, the capitalist modernity is a very, very extensive form of very refined, developed form of patriarchy, which starts actually in Middle East. So the reason why Öcalan says now it's our turn in Kurdistan or Middle East to correct the historical mistakes is because the base of capitalist modernity, which is the patriarchy, was already starting in Middle East, in Lower Mesopotamia, around the area of Ur. You remember Pope was visiting the area saying this is the birthplace of Abraham, but the city of Ur, south from Baghdad, is actually the place where patriarchal dominancy transformed to a capitalistic system. It's, with the building of ziggurats as a prototype of a state culture or state establishment starts in the region there, based on the patriarchy, which defeated the matricentristic societies in Upper Mesopotamia. And then Europe was taking this from that area. So first the Egypt Empire, pharaohs, and then from them to Hellenic Empire and Roman, and it came then to Europe. So in the last 500 years, beginning in the 16th century, Europe were getting all the experiences of state, patriarchy, capitalism, and transformed the state from Uruk to nation state of France, Britain, and later on, these nation states again were opposed on the region of Middle East in 1923 through the Lausanne Treaty.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another question is, I do not know that I missed or she forgot to explain page 13. Could you please open up page 13 again?
So the issue of historical materialism, you mean? Bertin,
I guess that, yeah, I guess that's what you meant.
Well, Öcalan's, the main critics of Öcalan in Marxist historical materialism is that he says Marx is searching, analyzing everything from the perspective of economic production. But he says this is also today's problem of most of the left movements. Whenever people are talking about the revolution, Rojava or the PKK, they say, well, Öcalan hasn't understand Marx because he has not the focus on economic production like Marx did. And Öcalan says the most important thing is the political thought of a society. So exploitation starts in the thought and mindset of the humans. So, and there's a important vital part of human societal experiences, like in the era of Neolithic revolution, and many of the groups during after the Neolithic revolution, they continued with the values of from that time. So the issue of sharing of material values is continuing in Middle East and is hidden, continued in hidden form in Islam, in Judaism, in Christianity. So he says, that's why he says democratic modernity is still alive. So the values of the societies are alive. Also, he says that capitalism has took over some of the values and gains of the societies from that time. And he says the historical materialism it's mostly influenced by the thinking of positivism, which is dividing everything in life in positive objects and subjects. He says that also Marx was influenced by this methodology of positivism, which is a clear division of the brain of humans and legitimation that the societies as objects and the rulers as subjects, so that the rulers have the legitimation to rule, and those as objects, the majority of the societies as objects. And he says there's no. He's criticizing the deterministics of Marxist methodology, like we have seen in how he's dividing the history of societies in these categories. So the history of societies is not linear. It's very dynamic. And there's no need that any society should experience one stage to gain the other stage. He says there are thousands of elements hidden in any of the experiences of the societies, and the role of revolutionaries must be to have a look on the hidden values, which are very dynamic, which includes also metaphysics. So because in Marxism, Marxist historical materialism, There's also a leak of recognition of metaphysics, which was played an important role in the history of humanity generally. So these are the critics of Öcalan. He is not rejecting completely the historical materialism of Marxism, but says he understands himself as a continuation of the tradition, because he says no one in the world was able to analyze the capitalist system like Marx did, and no one in the world until today was able to describe and analyze state and revolution like Lenin did. But in the end, he says, however, both were very deep in analyzing of the capitalist system and suggesting alternative as the socialism. In the end, their project failed in form of real socialism. And he said the reason is they haven't been so much deep in the history of the societies, and Öcalan says my sources are the values which are hidden and still exist, and most of them exist in the societies of Middle East. That's I can give as a response.
Okay, thank you very much. And another question which received us was, so you have a lot of experience. So how do you see the situation with other socialists and Marxists? How do they deal with the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan in the praxis?
According to the Democrat understanding of the PKK, as I followed up, they are still much interested to act with revolutionary movements, and the form of critics against other ML parties or movements is mostly positive critics, trying to understand. It's not opposing others, their ideology or their achievements. Since it become itself had the experience of democratic transition, the method in relation with other revolutionary movement is convincing. The method, the most used instrument is convincing each other, process of exchanges on mutual respect. There's no arrogancy to say we are right, we are wrong, but like the PKK, other revolutionary movements also of course, are looking to liberate their societies, whether in form of class liberation struggle or in form of national liberation. So each society has to decide for their own which kind of struggle is important to them. But what the PKK and Öcalan are trying to say is to learning from the experiences of the collapse of Soviet Union, and says there's no need for socialism creating a state, because there are several ML parties who still insist that for defeating the strong capitalist states, there's a need of a strong capitalist socialist state. So Öcalan says state is anti-socialist itself. So it was the gap, or the gap which also the Bolsheviki revolution in the end fall in. That's why they try to help to prevent others to repeat the mistakes, but not in form of opposing or imposing, more in form of convincing each other. Because in the end, all of them, with their specific characteristic experiences, try to find a solution against the capitalist system.
So when we talk about Abdullah Öcalan, we have to know that he's right now in a complete, total isolation. How do you explain the silence about this situation worldwide? So why is it that, for example, a man with these ideas is in a total isolation, and there's so less anger worldwide if you look at it.
Well, I think the reason why he was abducted is because those who forced him to leave Syria in 1998 was they understood Öcalan. They have seen that he would one day find this alternative, which we call today the new paradigm based on democracy, ecology, and women liberation for Middle East, and they know that they will have difficulties to reform the collapsing nation state, which they built it after the First World War. And I've seen that Öcalan is on the right way because since the talks about perestroika and glasnost from Gorbachev, the last Soviet president in 1986, Öcalan was already at that time busy with questioning real socialism, and in his that's why he then later on said this can't be the socialism we wish to have in Kurdistan. Because the Communist Party and the state became the same and as oppressive instruments against the societies and also the proletariat in these countries. I think those who abducted him have understand him beforehand. And the other point is, of course, we have to consider that the involvement of the CIA and Mossad in abduction of Öcalan is because Turkey is a member state of the NATO, and in 1952, when the US insists to get Turkey on the boat in the NATO, was to give Turkey the job, become a wall against the influence of socialism from the Soviet Union in Middle East. This was a role given to Turkey as a member state of the NATO. And in the Article 5 of NATO, it said whenever one member state is threatened, the others has to help. And Turkey was benefiting from this Article 5 of the NATO. Whenever there was a rebellion of revolutionary movements in Turkey, like in the 70s, the military coup in 1980 was then supported by the NATO, and as a result, thousands of revolutionary Turks and Kurds and other ethnic groups were killed or imprisoned, and some thousands became refugees, left the country. So every military coup in Turkey against revolutionary movements was supported by the NATO, and this is the reason why also the PKK was considered or still considered as a terrorist organization. Firstly by Germany in 1993, then by the US in 1997, and then by UK 2001, and by the European Union 2002. So the aim of discrimination of PKK and Öcalan is through criminalization, preventing others to be interested in the solution alternative of Öcalan and PKK.
Thank you very much. So these were all the questions, Nilüfer. Thank you very much for joining us and telling us.
I think there's a question about the 13th page in my presentation, isn't it? So I will go back to page 13.
Oh, you can go back. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know. So
there wasn't a special question, just the side. The friend said that she missed the page 13. So could you explain again?
Yes, it's page 13. It's important why Öcalan is implementing the idea of democratic socialism in Kurdistan and Middle East. Why his paradigm is more practicable in Middle East and Kurdistan. The reason is, he says, go back to the history of the democratic societies, the culture of democratic societies before the state were implemented 5,000 years ago. And he says this region has values of Neolithical culture, means there are several hundreds of tribes, not just amongst the Kurds, also amongst the Arabs and other components of the region, have still a strong understanding of mutual respect, sharing of values, and coexistence of diversity is still possible. However, the nation states were imposed on them 70 years ago. So he says, this is the ground for me where I can, where democratic modernity or democratic alternative can be easily accepted, because there's also already ground of societies which are not nation-state societies, because each of the societies or the components of ethnic or religious groups in Middle East, particularly in Kurdistan, survived the oppression, regression of the nation states. Since they were organized in tribal structures, in clan structures, or in religious orders, there are several hundreds of this kind of communities in the region. And we have seen this as possible. The example in Rojava shows that the communities can survive together, can act together. When you compare the experience of Rojava with other parts of collapsing states in Middle East, the rescuing point for Syria was the paradigm of Öcalan. With the people in Libya to take over this paradigm, I think they could also achieve having other circumstances than war, like they're facing today, or in Yemen or other parts of the states who are collapsing. I think the reason why in Syria there's another alternative, it's possible, it's because of this paradigm, which is based on the unity of different communities, societies in Syria. So this experience of Rojava shows that Kurds, Arabs, Armenians, Assyrians, Chechens, Turkmens can exist together, can act together, can administrate politics and economy for their own. So they show there's no need for centralized structures like a state. This is, I think, therefore, the model of Rojava shows that the paradigm of Öcalan is not just a theory, based on the historical truth of the region, which is very widely described in his first and in his all 5 books from 2001-2013.
Thank you. So 2 friends just raised their hand, and I just asked them to write the questions in the chat. So if you want to add something right now, it's the last chance. So we have on YouTube questions too.
Berfin, I can't hear you.
Yeah, just a second. There was a question. I was wondering if dear Koch comment on the role of dispersion of Kurdish communities around the world and the development of democratic confederalism within the understanding of Öcalan. Did you hear me clearly? No, you didn't. I will repeat the question, I guess. Do you hear me now?
Yes, but unclear.
I hope you can hear me.
Well, I understand the question.
Okay, I can write you the question as well.
Diaspora and the confederalism,
okay,
like that, isn't?
Like the question was, I was wondering if dear coach comment on the role of the development of democratic confederalism with the understanding of Öcalan.
For the Kurds in the diaspora or what?
I guess, yeah.
Okay. Well, democratic confederalism is actually the name of a non-state democracy, stateless democracy, and means that every society which is existing in the current capitalist system can create organizations, structures for self-ruling in the frame of the opportunities they got. So Öcalan says it should follow the strategy state plus democracy, means the state can't feed all the needs of a society, and in this case the society should organize to respond its own needs. In this, the state has to recognize and respect that the society should have the right of democratic self-organizing, and the democratic society, or those elements or components of a society who are looking for alternatives for their future, they should not always look for help from the state. Take care on their own is the suggestion of Öcalan and PKK, and the Kurdish community, which is spread all around the world. In the US, there are thousands of Kurds in the US, in Canada, in European countries, in former Soviet Union, in the Arab countries. Now, what the Kurds today do is they are organizing themselves in the current existing system. And also the solution to the Kurdish problem in Middle East, Kurdistan, as you know, is occupied by Turkey and still Iran. But two parts of Kurdistan has a different stance now. Iraqi Kurdistan in South Kurdistan in North Iraq, and Northeast Syria, Rojava in Syria, has already gained a status of autonomy. And Öcalan says, well, if the Kurds in Iran and Turkey would get a similar democratic autonomy like in North and East Syria, then that can implement a system of federation in 4 states for the Kurds, and there's no need to change any borders. So the solution can happen in the current existing borders. So the same, he says, you can implement or improve structures of democratic modernity in capitalist modernity. So there's no need for frontal clashes between two systems like it was understanding of the classic revolutions. No, he says don't look so much on the state and don't ask the state for help, whether the state is represented by mayors, by any other officials. Take care on your own, but doing this organized. This is very important. And the Kurds in Europe, they have their own organization structures based on grassroots democracy. Everywhere there are hundreds of Kurdish associations, initiatives, and like in Rojava, in some parts in the world, the Kurds are now experimenting with cooperatives, and they're living and having their own communes. Also, the Kurdish women's movement has the same similar but autonomous structures. So all around, I think the Kurds are well organized in the form of democratic confederalism as an act of non-state democracy.
Thank you. We have 2 questions left. One is, do you think that European feminism will reach real liberating women, or are they still far from it away? And why?
I would generally say if you are against the destruction of climate, then you automatically must criticize state and capitalism. If you stay for environment, protection of environment is the same. And if you're looking for the rights of women or equal rights of women, then the same. There can't be a compromise between state capitalism and freedom of women, because capitalism and states are anti-women, anti-ecology, anti-environment. So that's why I think cutting the mental or the consciousness between the individuals and the system is important. I think going back to the grassroots of the women's world is the only way in which this European feminism can survive. Feminism, as its experience at its peak in the 70s until the 80s in Europe, was also important contribution to the Kurdish women's movement. The era of feminism generally is a contribution and the important historical gain of women's liberation as a part of the global women's liberation history or herstory. And today it's too much splitted by different forms of the capitalist system with different methods of intervention. And that's why there are several hundreds or thousands small groups of feminist or women movements. Problem is networking amongst them. The individualism which the capitalism enforced over the European societies has also influenced women, unfortunately. So, and you find more individuals in European movements than collective structures. This is a success or victory of the capitalist system, because through divide and rule, they divided the society in individuals. Made through the liberalism the individuals as a king, or manipulated that individuals are king of itself, and that's a very deeply issue of mentality and consciousness, also affected by women. But I see there's a hope. I see there's a new generation of young women in Europe rethinking or questioning the experiences of feminism and the history of women before feminism in Europe. And I think this new generation of young women, the most trend of them is showing that they are very clear in their goals and that they are ready to cut their mental dependency on the capitalist system. I think this is an important move. We have seen this in Poland when the women were asking for the right of abortion. It was very important. And we see in many of the movements for climate or other environment issues, the majority of those who are participating are women. And most of them are led by women. This is an important move I think it's a new form of participation of women in politics and social issues. And this is giving hope also. And also the exchanges between the Kurdish women's revolution, experiences of the Kurdish women's revolution with the feminist movements and women's groups is growing, increasing, and that's also important, not just for the Europeans, but also for the Kurdish women's movement. We have find bridges to learn from each other, because we are all living in the same globe and we need each other. I think in Europe, I see a positive tendency in the women's movement, and not just in the women. I mean, we shouldn't just see the women organized in women's structures, but also women who are involved in politics, women in political movements, in initiatives, in anarchist movements, in the movements of against racism, fascism. There are a lot of women very active in politics, but the only problem is being organized and getting networks. This is the step we need for the short future in Europe. This is very needed, coming together and acting together building collective structures by keeping the diverse political identities or ideological, except the fascist and the racist and the sexist one. Berfin? Hello? 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 What's happened? I think I guess there's a technical problem. Well, I think we came to the end. Oh, I can't hear the moderator. Oh, there was a question if I believe there's a Marxist state. No, I don't believe so. But nevertheless, when I was speaking about Öcalan's criticism of Marxism, he don't reject him completely. He just said that oh yes. Oh, can you hear me? I really don't know what's happening. Okay, I think we have a technical problem, and I was asked to say the final words. I think there are no more questions. When the Kurds are asking to get support and solidarity from US, or particularly when the PKK is asking, like one of the co-founder of the PKK recently did, Mr. Cemil Bayik, it doesn't mean just the support or solidarity is with the Kurdish people. More is a solidarity with the alternative model, which is implemented in Kurdistan and led by the Kurds, and particularly by Kurdish women. It can become a hope for the whole region, for Middle East, because there's no currently there's no other alternative, as we have seen in the turmoil in the region, the collapse of the states. We have seen what's happening in what's happened in Libya. We see daily what's the bargainings over Afghanistan, and in other states in North Africa. People in Middle East, they are now looking and hoping for alternative like the one in Rojava, because it's giving the hope that people can have their own solutions. And by supporting the Kurdish movement or the Kurdish people led by the PKK and Öcalan, you automatically also support the solution. This is the reason why the wave of discrimination of Öcalan and PKK is continuing. It is understandable why the global players or the hegemonial powers are rejecting the ideas and existence and the stance of PKK, because it's a threat to their capitalist understanding, but it is not understandable why those oppressed, whether ethnically or from class perspective or from gender perspective, are looking on the PKK and Öcalan with the glasses of the capitalist system. I think there's a need of a change. It's important, vital for the Kurdish movement generally, that seeing the PKK and Öcalan from different perspectives, not just as a national liberation movement. Of course, it is also primarily interested acting for the self-determination of the Kurds, but self-determination for the Kurds means through democratization of Kurdistan, which means changes of structures, political administrative structures of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So means a solution to the Kurdish problem needs the democratization of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And that's why there's a strong symbiotic relation between self-determination rights of the Kurds and democratization of the occupying states. In the end, all the oppressed in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey will benefit from the struggle of the Kurdish people. That's why supporting Kurdish liberation movement means helping others also to become free in the region, in the very center of the war of the 21st century. In this hope, I hope you will stay with the Kurdish people, particularly with the Kurdish women. And from my side, I say thank you. You have listened, and your questions were showing that there are a lot of in the audience interested to learn more. There are several sites, homepages of the Kurdish movement, particularly which are publishing in genealogy, are the homepages of genealogy, the Kurdish women's science. There's also a website called Commune Academy, and where you can find theoretical analysis much, and there are several others. So in this sense, I wish all of you enjoy the rest of your. And thank you, Berfin. I didn't know what's happened to you. Hope the next time we will get better technical opportunities. So take care and good evening.